The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Kansas, as if even the heavens themselves recoiled from what was about to unfold. Margaret Walsh stood in the center of the town square, her wrists bound to the whipping post that had been erected just for this occasion. The rough hemp rope bit into her skin, but she kept her chin raised, her gray eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the gathering crowd. 100 lashes. The judge had pronounced the sentence 3 days prior, his voice carrying the weight of righteous condemnation. For the sin of barrenness, for denying her husband his God-given right to progeny, Margaret Walsh shall receive 100 lashes as punishment and warning to all women who fail in their sacred duty. The townspeople had begun gathering before dawn, their faces a mixture of curiosity, pity, and cruel satisfaction. Women clutched their children closer, as if Margaret's condition might somehow be contagious. Men spat tobacco juice into the dirt and muttered among themselves about the natural order of things. "Cursed," whispered Mrs. Henderson to her neighbor, her voice carrying on the morning breeze. 7 years married and not a single child. It's unnatural, I tell you. "Better off dead," agreed Mr. Cromwell, the blacksmith, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron. "What use is a woman who can't bear children like a field that won't take seed?" Margaret heard every word, each one landing like a blow before the physical punishment had even begun. She searched the crowd for one face, one pair of eyes that might show her mercy or understanding. Instead, she found Theodore Walsh, her husband of 7 years, standing near the front with his arm possessively wrapped around the waist of Sarah Morton, the banker's daughter. Sarah's hand rested conspicuously on her slightly rounded belly, her condition a deliberate insult to Margaret's failure. Theodore had filed for divorce immediately after the doctor's final pronouncement 6 months ago. Barren, the old physician had declared, though he'd barely examined her. The divorce had been granted swiftly. A man had rights, after all. And what good was a wife who couldn't provide him with sons? Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, uncoiling the leather whip with practiced efficiency. He was a hard man, weathered by years of frontier justice, but Margaret thought she saw a flicker of reluctance in his eyes. "Margaret Walsh," he intoned, "you have been sentenced to receive 100 lashes for the crime of willful barrenness and the denial of your womanly duties. May God have mercy on your soul." The first strike fell like lightning across her back, tearing through the thin fabric of her dress. Margaret bit down hard on her lip, tasting blood, but she did not cry out. She would not give them that satisfaction. "1," counted Deputy Harrison, his voice unnaturally loud in the morning air. The second lash followed quickly, then the third. Each strike opened new wounds, painting crimson stripes across her pale skin. The crowd watched in rapt attention, some counting along, others offering commentary on her fortitude or lack thereof. "She's too proud," hissed Judith Blackwood, the mayor's wife. "That's always been her problem. Thought she was better than the rest of us with her reading and her fancy Eastern education." By the 20th lash, Margaret's legs began to tremble. The post was slick with her blood, and her fingers had gone numb from gripping so tightly. Still, she did not cry out. She thought of her mother, dead these 15 years, who had taught her that a lady maintains her dignity no matter the circumstances. "Worthless!" someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "A woman who can't birth children ain't worth the food she eats." Theodore watched impassively, occasionally whispering something in Sarah Morton's ear that made the young woman giggle. He had courted Margaret for 2 years, promising her the moon and stars, speaking of the large family they would raise together. Now he looked at her as one might look at a lame horse with disgust and disappointment. 50 lashes! Margaret's knees buckled, but she forced herself to remain standing. The pain had become a living thing, a creature of fire and agony that consumed her entire being. Blood ran in rivulets down her legs, pooling in the dust at her feet. "Still ain't crying," observed someone with a mixture of admiration and annoyance. "Stubborn as a mule, that one." Sheriff Coleman paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. Even he seemed affected by the brutality of the sentence. Though he continued his duty without complaint, this was the law, after all, and the law must be upheld. 75 lashes. Margaret's vision began to blur, darkness creeping in from the edges. She could no longer feel individual strikes. Her entire back had become one massive wound. The crowd had grown quieter now, perhaps finally grasping the horror of what they were witnessing. Young Timothy Morrison, the Reverend's son, turned away and vomited behind his mother's skirts. A few other children began to cry, but their parents hushed them quickly. This was meant to be a lesson, after all. 90 lashes. Margaret's body finally betrayed her. She slumped forward, held upright only by the ropes binding her wrists. Still conscious, still aware, but no longer able to support her own weight. The final 10 lashes fell on a body that could no longer respond, though she felt every one. 100, Deputy Harrison announced, his voice hoarse. Sheriff Coleman stepped back, coiling his bloodied whip. The crowd stood in momentary silence, unsure of what came next. Then Theodore Walsh stepped forward, carefully avoiding the blood-soaked ground. "Let this be a lesson," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the square. "A woman's duty is sacred. Those who fail in it deserve no mercy, no compassion." He turned to Sarah Morton, placing a protective hand on her belly. "Come, my dear. We have a wedding to plan." They walked away together, followed slowly by the rest of the crowd. Within minutes, the square had emptied, leaving Margaret alone, still bound to the post. The sun climbed higher, its rays beating down mercilessly on her ravaged back. It was Mrs. Chen, the Chinese laundress who lived on the outskirts of town, who finally cut Margaret down an hour later. The older woman said nothing as she gently lowered Margaret to the ground, merely clicking her tongue in disapproval at the cruelty of it all. Margaret lay in the dirt, her blood mixing with the dust to create a dark mud. She thought perhaps she should crawl to the river, let the current carry her away to a place where the pain would finally end. But even now, even broken and brutalized, something within her refused to surrender. She had endured 100 lashes. She had not cried. She had not begged. She had maintained her dignity in the face of unconscionable cruelty. And though her body was broken, though she had lost everything, her husband, her place in society, her very identity as a woman, she was still breathing. Margaret Walsh closed her eyes against the blazing sun and made herself a promise. She would survive this. Somehow, some way, she would survive. And perhaps, in surviving, she would find something more valuable than the approval of those who had watched her torture with such cold satisfaction. The river called to her, promising an end to the pain. But Margaret Walsh had endured 100 lashes without breaking. She would not break now. The autumn river ran cold and clear, its waters carrying fallen leaves like small boats sailing toward an unknown destination. Caleb Stone guided his wagon along the muddy bank, his 3 children huddled in the back among sacks of flour and supplies from town. The trip to Cedar Ridge had taken longer than expected, and now the sun hung low in the sky, painting the water gold and crimson. "Pa, can we stop?" asked Emma, his youngest at 6 years old. "I need to." "Just a moment more, sweetheart," Caleb replied, his eyes scanning for a suitable place to rest the horses. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags someone had discarded by the water's edge. But as the wagon drew closer, he realized with growing horror that it was a woman, lying face down in the mud, her dress torn and stained with what could only be blood. "Stay in the wagon," he commanded his children, his voice sharp with urgency. Sarah, his eldest at 14, immediately understood and pulled her younger siblings close. Caleb jumped down and approached the still form carefully. The woman's dark hair was matted with mud and blood, obscuring her face. When he gently turned her over, she let out a weak moan that told him she still lived. "Dear God," he whispered, taking in the extent of her injuries. Her back, visible through the torn fabric, was a mass of wounds, parallel lines that could only have been made by a whip. He'd seen such marks before, on men who'd run afoul of frontier justice, but never to this extent. 100 lashes, came a hoarse whisper. The woman's eyes had opened, gray as storm clouds, filled with pain but also something else, a fierce pride that even her current state couldn't extinguish. I didn't cry. Shh, don't try to talk, Caleb said, his mind racing. He couldn't leave her here, but moving her would cause excruciating pain. I'm going to help you. No, she whispered, trying to pull away. Let it take me. I'll do no such thing. Caleb's voice was firm. He'd buried his wife 2 years ago, watched helplessly as consumption took her despite all his prayers and the doctor's efforts. He wouldn't stand by and watch another soul slip away, not when he could prevent it. Sarah, he called to his daughter. Bring the blankets. Thomas, the water canteen, quickly now. His children obeyed without question, though he saw the shock in their eyes when they glimpsed the injured woman. Sarah, wise beyond her 14 years, immediately took charge of her siblings. Is she going to be all right, Pa? Thomas asked. At 10, he was old enough to understand the gravity of the situation. God willing, Caleb replied, carefully wrapping the woman in blankets. She cried out when the fabric touched her wounds, the first sound of pain she'd allowed herself. I'm sorry, but we need to get you somewhere warm and safe. The woman's eyes focused on him for the first time, seeming to truly see him. Why? She asked. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. I know you're hurt and need help. That's enough for now. With infinite care, Caleb lifted her into the wagon. She was lighter than he expected, as if pain and suffering had hollowed her out. The children made room, Emma offering her rag doll without prompting. For the hurt, the little girl said solemnly. The woman's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. Thank you, she whispered. The ride to the stone homestead was agony for all of them. Every bump and rut in the road drew gasps of pain from their passenger, though she bit her lip bloody trying to stay quiet. Caleb drove as carefully as he could, while Sarah held the woman's hand and murmured soothing words. The house appeared just as darkness fell completely, a modest but sturdy cabin Caleb had built with his own hands when he and Mary had first married. Smoke rose from the chimney. He'd banked the fire that morning, and it still smoldered. Thomas, run ahead and stoke the fire. Sarah, heat water. Emma, fetch the medical supplies from the shelf. His children scattered to their tasks while Caleb carried the woman inside. The main room was warm and welcoming, filled with the lingering presence of his late wife. Mary's quilt still lay across the rocking chair. Her books lined the shelf by the window. He laid the woman gently on his own bed, the only one large enough for an adult. She looked small and broken against the patchwork quilt Mary had sewn during her first pregnancy. I need to tend your wounds, he said quietly. It won't be proper, but propriety. The woman almost laughed, a bitter sound. I think we're well past that. She paused, then added, Margaret, my name is Margaret Walsh. Caleb recognized the surname. Theodore Walsh was known throughout the county as a successful merchant, but he asked no questions, focusing instead on the task at hand. Sarah brought hot water and clean cloth. At 14, she'd helped tend her mother during the final months and knew something of nursing. Together, father and daughter worked to clean the wounds, though both were horrified by what they revealed. Who did this? Sarah finally asked, her young voice trembling with anger. The law, Margaret replied, her voice distant. 100 lashes for the crime of being a barren woman. Caleb's hand stilled. He'd heard of such punishments in the territories, but had never believed them to be real. What kind of justice was this? Pa Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face grave. There's riders coming. 3 of them. Caleb stepped outside to meet them. recognizing Dr. Mills among the group. The other two were townsmen he knew by sight but not name. "Evening, Caleb." "Doctor," Mills said, dismounting. "Heard you picked up some trouble by the river." "I picked up an injured woman who needed help," Caleb replied evenly. "That woman is Margaret Walsh," one of the townsmen spat. "Baron, cursed. You do well to send her on her way before she brings her curse to your household." "The only curse I see is the cruelty of men who'd beat a woman near to death," Caleb responded, his voice hard. "You're not welcome here, any of you." "Doctor," Mills shifted uncomfortably. "I'm a doctor. Caleb, let me at least examine her." After a long moment, Caleb nodded. The doctor was a good man, even if he kept poor company. Inside, "Doctor." Mills examined Margaret with professional detachment, though Caleb saw him pale at the extent of her injuries. "These need proper tending," he said quietly. "Infection is a real danger, and the scars—" "Will I live?" Margaret asked bluntly. "If you're strong enough, if you want to." "I survived 100 lashes," she said. "I suppose I can survive the healing too." "Doctor." Mills left medicines and instructions, warning Caleb once more about the danger of harboring a cursed woman. Caleb thanked him coldly and showed him out. Later, as the children prepared for bed, Emma crept to Margaret's bedside and placed her rag doll on the pillow. "Her name is Beth," she whispered. "She helps with bad dreams." Margaret's fingers closed gently around the doll. "Thank you, little one." "Are you really cursed?" Emma asked with the directness of childhood. "Emma," Sarah scolded, but Margaret raised a weak hand. "Some people think so," she answered honestly. "Because I couldn't have babies." Emma considered this seriously. "That's not a curse. That's just sad. Like when our hen stopped laying eggs. Pa didn't hurt her. He just said she was tired." Out of the mouths of babes, Caleb thought, watching from the doorway. As the night deepened, fever took hold. Margaret thrashed in delirium, reliving her ordeal. Caleb sat beside her, cooling her face with damp cloths, speaking soft words of comfort. Sometimes she mistook him for Theodore, begging forgiveness for her failure. Other times she called for her mother, long dead. 100 lashes, she repeated over and over. "I didn't cry, couldn't give them that." "No," Caleb agreed softly. "I don't suppose you did." Dawn broke gray and uncertain. Margaret's fever had broken in the night, leaving her weak but lucid. She found Caleb asleep in the chair beside her bed. His children curled up on the floor nearby like puppies, unwilling to be far from the drama unfolding in their home. She studied them in the pale light, this family that had taken her in without question, that had shown her more kindness in one night than she'd received in months. The little one, Emma, still clutched another doll, having given hers away. Thomas had his arm protectively over his youngest sister. Sarah slept with one hand on her father's knee, as if to anchor him. They were beautiful in their simplicity, their love for each other evident even in sleep. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, not her body this time, but the walls she'd built around her heart. When Caleb woke, he found her crying silently, tears sliding down her cheeks to dampen the pillow. "Pain?" he asked, immediately alert. "Yes," she admitted, "but not from the wounds." He understood. Sometimes the heart hurt worse than any physical injury. He'd learned that when Mary died, leaving him with 3 children and a soul full of grief. "You're safe here," he said simply, "for as long as you need." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. A widower with calloused hands and kind eyes, premature gray in his dark hair. The weight of responsibility and loss etched in the lines of his face. Not a handsome man by society's standards, but something better, a good man. "Why?" she asked again. This time he had an answer. Because everyone deserves a chance to heal, body and soul. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, filling the room with golden light. It would be a long road to recovery. Margaret knew her body would heal, though it would carry scars forever, but perhaps in this unlikely place with this unlikely family, her soul might heal too. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in months, allowed herself to hope. The fever dreams came every night for 2 weeks, turning Margaret's sleep into a battlefield where past and present collided. In her delirium, she was back at the whipping post, the leather striking her flesh while the crowd counted. But sometimes the nightmare shifted, and instead of Theodore's cold face, she saw Caleb Stone standing among the watchers, his kind eyes filled with disappointment. "No," she would cry out, thrashing against the quilts. "Not him. He doesn't belong there." Caleb kept his vigil, night after night, cooling her burning skin with damp cloths and speaking soft reassurances. His children took turns as well, refusing to let their father bear the burden alone. Sarah would read from her mother's Bible, her young voice steady despite the horror of Margaret's injuries. Thomas whittled small animals from wood scraps, leaving them on the bedside table like protective talismans. And Emma, sweet Emma, would sing the lullabies her mother had once sung, her childish voice cutting through the darkness of Margaret's dreams. Dr. Mills came every third day, his face grave as he examined the healing wounds. The lash marks were beginning to close, but infection had set in along several of the deeper cuts. He cleaned them with carbolic acid that made Margaret bite through a leather strap to keep from screaming. "I must be honest," he told Caleb during one visit, speaking quietly in the main room while Margaret dozed fitfully. "The physical wounds will heal, though the scarring will be extensive, but the fever, it's taking a toll. She needs to want to live. Caleb, without that will, all my medicines are useless." "She's strong," Caleb replied, though privately he worried. Some days Margaret seemed to fade before their eyes, as if she were slowly becoming transparent, preparing to slip away entirely. Perhaps, but strength alone isn't always enough. "Dr. Mills paused at the door, his medical bag in hand. "You should know. There's talk in town. People are saying you've taken in a cursed woman. Some are saying worse, that you're living in sin with Theodore Walsh's discarded wife." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Let them talk. Their words can't hurt us here." "Words have a way of becoming actions, my friend. Be careful." That night, Margaret's fever spiked higher than ever before. She trembled violently, her teeth chattering despite the multiple quilts piled atop her. In her delirium, she was a child again, standing in her mother's garden in Massachusetts, before her father had dragged them west in search of fortune that never came. "Mama," she whispered, reaching for someone who wasn't there. "The roses are dying. I tried to water them, but they're dying anyway." Emma, who had crept from her bed to check on Margaret, tugged on her father's sleeve. "Pa, she's talking about roses. We should give her something beautiful to look at." "It's past midnight, sweetheart. Where would we find roses?" The little girl disappeared into the room she shared with Sarah, returning with something clutched in her small hands. It was her most prized possession, a rag doll her mother had made just months before her death. Unlike the simple doll she'd given Margaret, this one wore a dress of fine calico, with yarn hair the same wheat color as Mary Stone's had been, and embroidered roses on the apron. "Give her Mama's doll," Emma said solemnly. "It has roses. Seeing Mama's love is still in it. That will help chase the bad dreams away." Caleb's throat tightened. "Emma, that's your special doll. You don't have to." "Yes, I do." The 6-year-old's face was fierce with determination. "Mama would want to help. She always helped sick people." Gently, Emma placed the precious doll in Margaret's arms. The delirious woman clutched it close, her fingers finding the embroidered roses. Slowly, miraculously, her breathing eased. "See?" Emma whispered. "Mama's helping." The crisis passed that night, when dawn broke. Margaret's fever had finally broken for good. Leaving her weak but clear-eyed, she found herself holding a beautiful doll, while a small girl slept curled against her side like a trusting kitten. "She gave you her mother's doll," Caleb explained softly when he saw Margaret's questioning look. "Said it would help chase the nightmares away." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Not from pain this time, but from an emotion she'd thought beaten out of her wonder at the pure generosity of a child's love. As the days passed and Margaret grew stronger, she began to venture from the bed for short periods. The first time she made it to the kitchen table for a meal, the children cheered as if she'd accomplished something magnificent. In a way, she had. "You're getting better," Thomas observed, his 10-year-old face serious as he studied her. "Your eyes don't look so sad anymore." "Do they not?" Margaret asked, managing a small smile. "No, they look like our pa's eyes after Mama died, all empty-like, but they're filling up again." Children saw things so clearly sometimes. Margaret thought perhaps her eyes were indeed filling up with gratitude, with affection for this little family, with something dangerously close to hope. But the nightmares persisted. Not every night now, but often enough. She would wake gasping, phantom pain shooting across her back, the sound of the crowd's cruel laughter echoing in her ears. One particularly bad night, she woke to find all 3 children standing by her bedside, their faces solemn in the lamplight. "We've decided," Sarah announced, speaking for the group. "We're going to stand guard." "Stand guard," Margaret repeated, confused. "Against the nightmares," Thomas explained, brandishing a wooden sword he'd carved himself. "We'll take turns. They can't get you if we're watching." "And I'll sing," Emma added, clutching her mother's hymnal. "Monsters don't like singing." Margaret looked to Caleb, who stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow at his children's determination. "You don't have to," Margaret began, but Sarah interrupted. "Yes, we do. You're family now." The word hit Margaret like a physical blow. Family. She'd had a family once, parents who'd died disappointed in their spinster daughter, a husband who'd cast her aside like a barren field. But this was different. This was chosen family, bound not by blood or law, but by something stronger. "I was told I was cursed," she whispered, her voice thick, "that I would bring nothing but sorrow to any household that took me in." Well, they were wrong, Thomas declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "You brought us someone new to love. That's not a curse. That's a gift." Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Like when we found that injured rabbit? Everyone said it would die, but we took care of it and it got better and had babies in our garden." "Though you're not a rabbit," Thomas added hastily, making Margaret actually laugh for the first time since her ordeal. The sound seemed to surprise everyone, including Margaret herself. It was rusty from disuse, but genuine. "No," she agreed, wiping tears from her eyes. "I'm not a rabbit." The children kept their word about standing guard. Each night, one of them would sit by her bed, sometimes reading, sometimes whittling, sometimes just being present. And slowly, incrementally, the nightmares began to lose their power. Dr. Mills, on his next visit, was amazed by her progress. "I've never seen anything like it," he admitted, checking her healing wounds. "By all rights, with injuries this severe and the infection." "I had good nurses," Margaret said, smiling at the children who beamed with pride. The doctor pulled Caleb aside before leaving. "There's something you should know. Theodore Walsh has officially remarried that Morton girl, and there are rumors that she's already with child." Caleb's face darkened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because some folks are saying Margaret cursed him somehow, that she's practicing dark arts to get revenge. Ridiculous, of course. But people believe what they want to believe, and Mayor Blackwood has been making noise about improper living arrangements out here. Let him come, Caleb said quietly but firmly. He'll find nothing improper, just a family taking care of someone who needed help. That evening, as Margaret sat by the fire attempting to mend one of Emma's dresses, her fingers were still clumsy. But, improving, she overheard the conversation between Caleb and his eldest daughter. "Pa," Sarah said quietly, "are we going to have to send Miss Margaret away?" "No one's sending anyone away," Caleb replied firmly. "But what if the mayor? Then we'll face whatever comes. Together. Your mother would have done the same." "I think Mama would have liked her," Sarah said after a pause. "Miss Margaret, she's teaching Emma to read better than I could, and she helped Thomas with his arithmetic yesterday." "Is that so? And she makes you smile?" "Pa, not the pretend smile you do for us sometimes. Real smiles." Margaret's hands stilled on the mending. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed the small things she'd been trying to do to contribute to the household, to repay their kindness in whatever ways her healing body would allow. Later that night, as the household prepared for bed, Emma approached Margaret with something hidden behind her back. "I made you something," the little girl announced, producing a lumpy, misshapen object that might charitably be called a doll. It was made of scraps and stuffed with straw, with button eyes placed at slightly different heights and yarn hair that stuck out at wild angles. "She's not pretty like Mama's doll," Emma said anxiously. "But I made her special for you. See, she has a strong back." The child turned the doll around to show a piece of leather sewn across the back, "So she can protect yours while it finishes healing." Margaret took the doll with shaking hands, cradling it as carefully as if it were made of spun glass. "She's perfect," she whispered. "The most beautiful doll I've ever seen." "Really?" Emma's face lit up. "Really? What's her name?" Emma considered this seriously. "Hope. Her name is Hope." That night, Margaret slept peacefully, without nightmares, holding Hope the doll close. For the first time since that terrible morning in the town square, she began to believe that perhaps her life wasn't over. Perhaps, in this small cabin with these extraordinary people, it was just beginning. The scars would always be there, both on her body and in her soul. But scars, she was learning, were not just reminders of pain. They were proof of survival, testament to strength. And sometimes, just sometimes, they were the very cracks through which the light could finally enter. The first snow had begun to fall when Caleb suggested Margaret join them for Sunday services. She'd been with them for nearly 2 months now, her body healing remarkably well under the constant care of the Stone family. The physical scars remained, would always remain, but she could move without pain, could work alongside Sarah in the kitchen and help Thomas with his lessons. "I don't know," Margaret said quietly, her hands stilling on the bread dough she'd been kneading. "To appear in church, after everything. You have as much right to seek comfort in God's house as anyone," Caleb replied firmly. "More, perhaps." Sarah looked up from where she was braiding Emma's hair. "Please come, Miss Margaret. We'd be proud to have you sit with us." Margaret's throat tightened at the girl's simple declaration. Proud. When was the last time anyone had been proud to be seen with her? "The townspeople. We'll have to accept that you're part of our family now." Thomas interrupted, his jaw set in a way that reminded Margaret startlingly of his father. "And if they say anything cruel, they'll have to answer to me." Despite her fears, Margaret found herself smiling at the boy's fierce protectiveness. "Oh, will they now?" "Yes, ma'am, I've been practicing with my slingshot. My aim is getting real good." "Thomas Stone," Caleb warned, though his lips twitched. "We don't solve problems with slingshots." "David did," Emma piped up, proud of her biblical knowledge. "That was different, little one," her father said, ruffling her carefully braided hair much to Sarah's dismay. In the end, Margaret agreed to go, though her hands shook as she put on the best dress Sarah had helped her alter to fit her thin frame. It was one of Mary Stone's, a deep blue wool that brought out the gray in Margaret's eyes. "You look beautiful," Emma declared, spinning around to make her own skirts flare. The ride to town seemed both endless and far too short. Margaret sat between Sarah and Caleb on the wagon seat, with Thomas and Emma bundled in quilts in the back. The snow fell softly, muffling sound and making the world seem clean and new. But as they approached the church, Margaret felt her courage faltering. Wagons and horses filled the yard, and she could see the townspeople gathering, their Sunday finest dark against the white snow. "I can't," she whispered, her hand gripping Caleb's arm. They all watched. They all stood there and watched while... "And now they'll watch something different," Caleb said quietly. "They'll see a woman of dignity and grace, surrounded by people who care for her. Let them watch that." He helped her down from the wagon, keeping her hand tucked firmly in the crook of his arm. The children flanked them like a small battalion, Sarah on Margaret's other side, Thomas and Emma just ahead, clearing a path. The crowd parted as they approached, whispers rising like wind through wheat. Margaret kept her eyes forward, focusing on the church doors, on putting one foot in front of the other. Then she saw him. Theodore Walsh stood near the entrance with his new wife, Sarah Morton Walsh, whose belly was now prominently rounded beneath her fine wool coat. Theodore's eyes met Margaret's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. He looked different somehow, older, perhaps, or maybe she was simply seeing him clearly for the first time. Had he always been so small, so pinched around the mouth? Had his eyes always been that cold shade of blue, like winter ice that would crack under the slightest pressure? "Margaret," he said, her name sounding strange on his lips after months of silence. She said nothing, merely inclined her head slightly, the way she might acknowledge a stranger. Sarah Morton Walsh tugged on her husband's arm, her pretty face marred by a sneer. "Come, Theodore. We needn't associate with the cursed." It was then that Margaret noticed the bruise on the young woman's wrist, just visible beneath her glove, and another fading mark on her neck that her high collar couldn't quite hide. Their eyes met for an instant, and Margaret saw something she recognized all too well: fear. "Indeed." Mayor Blackwood's voice cut through the tension. He stood with a group of the town's leading men, including Samuel Hancock, who owned the largest ranch in the county. "I'm surprised to see you here, Mrs. Walsh, or what should we call you now? The divorced woman, the barren woman." "Her name is Miss Margaret," Emma said loudly, her child's voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "And she's teaching me to read better than anyone ever has." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter ran through some of the crowd, but Mayor Blackwood's face darkened. "Children should be taught to respect their betters. Stone." "They are," Caleb replied evenly. "That's why they defend Miss Margaret." The mayor stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not enough that others couldn't hear. "You're playing with fire, taking in a woman like that. Living under the same roof, no chaperone. What would your late wife think?" "She'd think I was doing the Christian thing," Caleb answered, his voice steady, though Margaret felt the tension in his arm. "Caring for the sick, sheltering the homeless. Or have you forgotten those parts of Scripture? Mayor—" "Don't you dare quote Scripture to me," Blackwood snarled. "Not while harboring a woman who was publicly punished for failing in her sacred duties. She's cursed, stone, barren as the desert. She'll bring nothing but misfortune to your household." "The only misfortune I see," a new voice interrupted, "is the cruelty of those who would beat a woman for something beyond her control." Reverend Morrison had emerged from the church, his weathered face grave. He was an older man, had been ministering in Cedar Ridge for 20 years, and commanded respect even from men like Blackwood. "Reverend," the mayor began, but Morrison held up a hand. "I've held my tongue too long. the minister said. "I stood by while this town committed an atrocity in the name of justice. No more." He looked directly at Margaret. "You are welcome in God's house, child, today and always." Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't touch her." The voice was Thomas's, and it rang with a fury that seemed too large for his 10-year-old frame. Samuel Hancock had moved toward Margaret, his hand outstretched as if to grab her arm, but Thomas had stepped between them, his small body rigid with determination. "Step aside, boy," Hancock growled. "This doesn't concern you." "You don't touch her," Thomas repeated, his hands clenched into fists. "Not ever, not any of you." "Thomas," Margaret said softly, touched by his protectiveness but fearing for his safety. Sarah moved to stand beside her brother, followed quickly by Emma, who clutched her father's leg but glared at the men with all the ferocity her 6 years could muster. "You heard my son," Caleb said, his voice carrying a warning that made several men step back. "No one touches Miss Margaret. Not now. Not ever." The standoff might have escalated, but Reverend Morrison cleared his throat. "The service is about to begin. I suggest we all remember whose house we're about to enter and conduct ourselves accordingly." Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd began to move into the church. Theodore and his new wife swept past without another word, though Margaret noticed how Sarah Morton Walsh kept touching her stomach, as if reassuring herself of the life growing within, or perhaps reminding Theodore of what Margaret had failed to provide. Inside the church, the Stone family filed into their usual pew. Margaret hesitated, unsure where to sit, but Emma tugged her hand insistently. "Here, Miss Margaret, between me and Pa, where you'll be safe." And so Margaret found herself seated in the middle of the Stone family. Emma pressed against her left side, Caleb a solid, reassuring presence on her right. Sarah and Thomas sat beyond their father, their backs straight and heads high, daring anyone to comment. The whispers continued throughout the service, a constant undercurrent to Reverend Morrison's sermon. But the minister seemed to have chosen his text deliberately, preaching on the woman taken in adultery, on casting the first stone, on mercy and redemption. "We are all broken," he said, his eyes moving across the congregation. "All fallen. The measure of a community is not in how harshly it punishes those who stumble, but in how it helps them rise again." Margaret felt Caleb's hand cover hers where it rested on the pew. A simple gesture of support, but it anchored her, kept her from fleeing when the stairs became too much. Halfway through the service, baby Joseph Hancock began to cry. His mother tried to quiet him, but the wails only grew louder. Without thinking, Margaret began to hum softly, an old lullaby her own mother had sung. The baby's cries slowly subsided, his attention caught by the melody. "Mrs." Hancock looked at Margaret with surprise, and something that might have been gratitude before her husband's glare made her turn away. But Margaret had seen it, that flash of common humanity, mother to woman, that transcended the town's harsh judgment. When the service ended, the congregation filed out slowly. Many gave the Stone family a wide berth, but a few, mostly women, nodded quietly to Margaret. Mrs. Chen, the Chinese laundress who had cut her down from the whipping post, pressed her hand briefly. Mrs. Muller, the German baker's wife, murmured something that might have been an apology. Outside, Theodore waited by their wagon, alone for once. "Margaret," he called as they approached. "A word." Caleb stepped forward, but Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "It's all right," she said quietly. "I should hear what he has to say." She approached her former husband, noting how he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Theodore." "You should leave town," he said without preamble. "For your own good, and theirs." He gestured to the Stone family. "You're bringing scandal on decent people." "Decent people," Margaret repeated, her voice steady despite the pain his presence caused. "Tell me, Theodore, What's decent about beating a woman for being unable to bear children? What's decent about casting aside 7 years of marriage without ever considering that perhaps the fault wasn't entirely mine? His face flushed. How dare you? I dare because I have nothing left to lose, she interrupted. You took everything from me. My home, my reputation, my place in society. You stood there and watched while they beat me bloody. So don't speak to me of decency. You were barren. He hissed. Useless. What was I supposed to do? You were supposed to love me, Margaret said simply, for better or worse. Remember those vows. Theodore, or did they mean as little to you as I did? She turned to go, but paused. Your new wife is beautiful, young, fertile. Apparently. I hope that's enough for you, because from the marks I saw on her skin, I'd say she's learning what I always knew, that nothing is ever enough for Theodore Walsh. She walked back to where the Stone family waited, her head high. Thomas grinned at her with fierce pride. Sarah took her hand. Emma hugged her waist. And Caleb looked at her as if seeing her anew. That was the bravest thing I ever saw, he said quietly as he helped her into the wagon. I don't feel brave, Margaret admitted as they pulled away from the church. I feel free. Sometimes, Caleb replied. They're the same thing. As they drove home through the falling snow, Margaret realized that she'd been wrong. The townspeople hadn't just watched her be broken that day. They'd watched her refuse to break, and today they'd watched her rise again, surrounded by love and defended by the fierce loyalty of 3 children who called her family. Let them watch. Let them whisper. She had survived 100 lashes without crying. She could survive their judgment too, and maybe, just maybe, she could do more than survive. Maybe she could live again. The pounding on the door came just after midnight, violent enough to shake the entire cabin. Margaret jolted awake in her small room off the kitchen, her heart racing as the familiar taste of fear flooded her mouth. She knew that sound, the sound of men who believed they had the right to take what they wanted. Stone, a voice bellowed. Open up, we know you're harboring that cursed woman. Through the thin walls, she heard Caleb's feet hit the floor, heard him tell his children to stay in their rooms. But Margaret knew better. She couldn't let this family suffer for their kindness to her. Wrapping a shawl around her nightgown, she moved toward the main room. Don't, Caleb said sharply as she emerged. He was already dressed, his rifle in his hands. Stay back. They're here for me, Margaret replied quietly. I won't have you or the children hurt because... You're part of this family, he interrupted, his voice firm. We protect our own. The pounding came again, harder this time. Last warning, Stone. Sarah appeared in the doorway of the room she shared with Emma, her mother's old pistol steady in her young hands. At 14, she'd learned to shoot out of necessity on the frontier, and her face showed no fear, only determination. Sarah, no, Caleb began, but his daughter shook her head. Mama always said we stand together. Pa, all of us. Through the window, Margaret could see torches, at least a dozen men, their faces hidden by darkness and malice. She recognized Mayor Blackwood's voice, Samuel Hancock's bulk, and others she couldn't identify. They'd been drinking. She could hear it in their slurred demands. Send her out. Stone! Blackwood shouted. She's brought nothing but shame to this town. First the barrenness, now living in sin with a widower. She needs to be taught another lesson. Or better yet, another voice added with ugly laughter. Driven out of town entirely. Tar and feathers ought to do it. Margaret's hands trembled, remembering the whipping post, the 100 lashes, the way these same men had watched her bleed. But before she could move toward the door, small fingers slipped into hers. You're not going out there, Emma said firmly, clutching Hope the doll in her other arm. Tell them, Pa, tell them she belongs here. Thomas appeared as well, still in his nightshirt, but holding his slingshot. They'll have to go through all of us, he declared, moving to stand beside his sister. Caleb looked at his children brave, loyal, fierce in their protection of someone they'd claimed as their own, and Margaret saw his jaw set with resolve. "Blackwood," he called through the door. "You're drunk and you're on my property. Take your men and leave. Now." "Or what?" Hancock's voice sneered. "You'll shoot us all. There's one of you and more than a dozen of us. Hand over the woman and we'll leave peaceful-like." "There's 5 of us," Sarah corrected loudly, her voice carrying clearly through the door. "And we're all armed." It wasn't entirely true unless you counted Thomas's slingshot and whatever Emma might do with her doll. But the men outside didn't know that. "You'd let your children die for that barren witch!" someone shouted. "I'd teach my children to stand up for what's right," Caleb replied. "Something you men seem to have forgotten." Margaret couldn't bear it anymore. These people had taken her in, healed her, given her a home. She wouldn't let them be hurt for it. Moving quickly, before anyone could stop her, she reached for the door. "No!" Thomas lunged forward, wrapping his thin arms around her waist. "You don't get to sacrifice yourself. That's not how family works." "Thomas is right," Caleb said quietly, not taking his eyes off the door. "We face this together or not at all." "Stone, we're losing patience," Blackwood called. "Send her out or we're coming in." "Then you'll be breaking into my home," Caleb responded. "And I'll be within my rights to defend it." There was murmuring outside, some of the men perhaps realizing that their liquid courage had led them to a dangerous place. Breaking down a man's door in the dead of night, threatening his children, even frontier justice had its limits. "She's cursed," Blackwood tried again, his voice slightly less certain. "Barren, she'll bring God's wrath down on all of us." "The only wrath I see is yours," Margaret found herself saying, her voice carrying through the door. "Tell me, Mayor, what kind of God demands a woman be beaten for something beyond her control? What kind of men stand in the darkness, drunk and threatening children?" "You dare lecture us on morality?" Hancock snarled. "Living here without proper chaperone, corrupting Stone's children." "She's teaching me to read," Emma's young voice piped up indignantly. "And she makes the best apple pie, and she tells us stories, and she fixed my doll when her arm came off. That's not corrupting." Despite the danger, Margaret felt her heart swell at the little girl's fierce defense. "Listen to yourselves," Caleb said, his voice carrying the weight of disgust. "Grown men, leaders of this community, standing outside my home in the dead of night, threatening a woman and children. Is this what Cedar Ridge has become?" There was shifting outside, the sound of feet moving in the snow. Some of the men were having second thoughts. Margaret realized. The momentum was breaking. Then came a new voice, unexpected but commanding. "What in the name of all that's holy is going on here?" "Reverend Morrison." Margaret recognized his voice immediately. "Reverend," Blackwood started, but Morrison cut him off. "I asked a question. Why are a dozen armed men surrounding the Stone residence at this ungodly hour?" "We're here to remove the cursed woman," someone said defensively. "She's living in sin, bringing shame." "The only shame I see," Morrison's voice was sharp as a blade, "is yours. Grown men acting like a mob, threatening violence against a family that has shown nothing but Christian charity." "You don't understand. Reverend," Blackwood tried again, "she's barren, divorced." "I understand perfectly," Morrison interrupted. "I understand that you're so drunk on your own righteousness that you've forgotten the most basic commandments. Love thy neighbor. Judge not lest ye be judged. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Through the window, Margaret could see the Reverend's slight figure moving among the men, his white hair visible in the torchlight. "Go home," he commanded. "All of you. Go home to your wives, your children. Pray for forgiveness for what you almost did here tonight. And if I hear of any further harassment of Miss Margaret or the Stone family, I'll preach about it from the pulpit. I'll name names. Is that clear?" There was grumbling, protests, but the mob was breaking apart. The Reverend's moral authority, combined with the Stone family's determined resistance, had taken the wind from their sails. "This isn't over," Blackwood muttered, but he was already backing away. "Yes, it is," Morrison said firmly. "It ends tonight. Whatever happened in the past, Miss Margaret has paid for it 100-fold. She deserves peace, and by God, she'll have it." Slowly, reluctantly, the men dispersed. The sound of horses and boots faded into the night, leaving behind an almost deafening silence. Caleb waited a full 10 minutes before lowering his rifle. "It's safe," he said quietly. Margaret found herself trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I brought this to your door. I should leave. I should—" "Don't you dare," Sarah said fiercely, setting down her pistol to wrap her arms around Margaret. "Don't you dare leave us!" "But the danger—" "Family protects each other," Emma said solemnly, climbing into Margaret's lap despite being a bit too big for it. "That's what family does." Thomas nodded, his young face serious. "We knew there might be trouble when we took you in. Pa explained it to us. We chose you anyway." Margaret looked up at Caleb through tears. "Why?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for months. "Why would you risk so much for me?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, then moved to kneel beside her chair. "Because everyone deserves a second chance. Because my children love you. Because—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because you've brought light back into this house. We were just existing after Mary died, going through the motions. You've helped us remember how to live again. We were like those seeds you planted in the kitchen garden," Emma added helpfully. "All dried up and sad, but you watered us with love and now we're growing again." "Out of the mouths of babes," Margaret thought, tears flowing freely now. A knock at the door made them all tense, but it was followed by Reverend Morrison's gentle voice. "It's just me. May I come in?" Caleb let him in, and the Reverend's kind eyes took in the scene the family huddled together, the weapons set aside, the tears and fierce love evident in the room. "I'm sorry I didn't arrive sooner," he said. "Mrs. Chen saw the men gathering and ran to fetch me." "You came just in time," Caleb assured him. Morrison looked at Margaret. "They won't bother you again. I'll make sure of it, but—" He hesitated, then continued gently. "It might be wise to make things more official, to remove any question of impropriety." Margaret felt her cheeks burn, understanding his meaning, but before she could speak, Emma yawned hugely. "Can we go back to bed now?" the little girl asked. "And can Miss Margaret sleep in the big room with us tonight, just to be safe?" And so it was that Margaret spent the rest of the night in the main room, surrounded by the Stone family. Sarah and Emma curled up on either side of her on the floor. Thomas kept watch by the window with his slingshot, and Caleb sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, standing guard. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Margaret looked around at these people who had stood ready to fight for her, who had claimed her as family when the rest of the world had cast her out. She had lost everything: her husband, her home, her place in society. She had endured 100 lashes and survived. But here, in this simple cabin with these extraordinary people, she had found something she'd never expected to find again. She had found home, and more than that, she had found the courage to fight for it. The men who had come in the night had expected to find her alone, vulnerable, the same broken woman they had left bleeding in the town square. Instead, they had found her transformed part of something larger than herself, protected by love fiercer than any mob's hatred. "Let them come again," she thought, tightening her arms around Emma's sleeping form. "Let them try to take this from her. They would learn what she had learned in these precious months, that family, true family, was stronger than fear, stronger than shame, stronger than all the cruel judgments of a harsh world. She had survived 100 lashes without crying, but now, surrounded by love, she wept freely not from pain or fear, but from gratitude too deep for words. The smell of smoke woke Margaret from restless sleep, acrid and wrong in the cold winter air. For a moment, she lay still, thinking perhaps someone had let the kitchen fire burn too high. Then she heard it, the terrified bellowing of cattle, the sharp whinny of horses in distress. "Fire!" Caleb's voice rang through the house. "The barn's on fire!" Margaret threw off her quilts and rushed to the window. Orange flames licked at the barn's roof, already consuming the dry timber despite the snow on the ground. The animals' cries pierced the night, desperate and afraid. Without thought for propriety or safety, Margaret ran outside in her nightgown and boots. Following Caleb and the children, the heat hit her face like a physical blow even from 20 yards away. "The horses!" Sarah cried, already running toward the structure. "Stay back," Caleb commanded, but his daughter didn't slow. Neither did Thomas, who grabbed buckets and headed for the well. "We have to get them out," Margaret said, her mind racing. 5 horses, a dozen cattle. The chickens in their coop attached to the barn's side, they'd lose everything if they didn't act quickly. "It's too dangerous," Caleb started, but Margaret was already moving. "You take the horses," she called over her shoulder. "I'll get the cattle." The heat inside the barn was overwhelming. Smoke thick enough to choke. Margaret pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, squinting through the orange-lit darkness. The cattle were pressed against the far wall, eyes rolling with terror, too panicked to find the exit. "Come on," she urged, slapping the nearest cow's flank. "Move! Get out!" But they wouldn't budge, paralyzed by fear. Through the smoke, she could see Caleb leading horses out one by one, their eyes wild, coats already singed. Sarah was beside him, brave beyond her years, while Thomas formed a bucket brigade with Emma, the little girl struggling with pails almost as big as she was. A beam crashed down behind Margaret, showering sparks. Time was running out. Then she remembered something her father had taught her years ago. Before drink took him, cattle would follow a leader, even into danger. She spotted the calf, the youngest of the herd, pressed against its mother. Without hesitation, Margaret wrapped her arms around the small creature and began backing toward the door. It struggled at first, but she held firm, murmuring nonsense words of comfort. As she'd hoped, the mother followed, lowing anxiously. And where the mother went, the others began to follow, their herd instinct finally overcoming panic. "That's it," Margaret encouraged, still backing up with the calf. "Come on, all of you, follow me." She emerged from the barn like some strange prophet, leading a line of cattle to safety, her nightgown singed and face blackened with soot. Behind her, another section of roof collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. "The chickens!" Emma cried, pointing to the coop already beginning to smoke. Without thinking, Margaret thrust the calf at Caleb and ran to the coop. The door was hot to the touch, but she yanked it open anyway, ignoring the pain. Chickens exploded out in a flurry of feathers and squawks, but she counted quickly. 2 were missing, huddled in the far corner. The smoke was thicker here, lower to the ground. Margaret dropped to her knees and crawled forward, her lungs burning. Her hands found warm feathers, and she grabbed both birds, backing out as quickly as she could. She emerged coughing, gasping. The chickens clutched to her chest. Strong hands pulled her away from the building. Caleb, his face tight with fear and something else. "Don't ever," he started, then stopped, pulling her against him instead. "Thank God you're all right." They stood together, watching helplessly as the barn continued to burn. The bucket brigade was hopeless against such an inferno. All they could do was keep it from spreading to the house. And then, miraculously, help arrived. Neighbors came riding hard over the hill. The Mullers, the Johnsons, even the Hendersons who had whispered so cruelly about Margaret in town. They brought more buckets, more hands, more hope. "Saw the smoke," Hans Muller explained breathlessly, immediately joining the bucket line. "Fire's everyone's enemy out here." Even more surprising was who came next, Mrs. Chen, with her sons. Several of the Mexican families from the edge of town, people who were often ignored or scorned by the proper townfolk. But fire didn't care about social standing, and neither did the code of the frontier when it came to a neighbor in need. They worked through the night, managing to save the house and most of the outbuildings. The barn was a total loss, but the animals were safe. Huddled together in the corral, Thomas and some of the men had hastily reinforced. As dawn broke, revealing the charred skeleton of what had been their barn, Margaret found herself sitting on the porch steps, Emma asleep in her lap, watching the community that had both condemned and saved them. "Miss Margaret." She looked up to find Sarah Morton Walsh standing before her, Theodore's new wife. The young woman's face was drawn, and Margaret could see fresh bruises on her neck, poorly hidden by a hastily tied scarf. "Mrs. Walsh," Margaret said carefully. Sarah glanced around nervously, then sat down beside her, uninvited but somehow welcome. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what I said at church, for everything." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "You're very young." 17, Sarah admitted. "I thought Theodore promised." She trailed off, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "I'm learning that promises don't mean much to some men." "No," Margaret agreed softly. "They don't. He says I'm too slow, too stupid, too—" Sarah's voice broke. "I'm carrying his child, and still it's not enough. Nothing's ever enough." Margaret recognized the despair in the girl's voice, remembered feeling it herself. But now, looking at the men and women still working to clear debris, at the children safe and alive, at Caleb directing the efforts with quiet efficiency, she realized something had changed. "You're right," she told Sarah. "Nothing's ever enough for men like Theodore. The fault isn't in us, it's in them." Sarah looked at her with desperate eyes. "How do you bear it? The shame, the whispers, I found a different family," Margaret interrupted gently, adjusting the sleeping Emma in her lap. "And I learned that the opinions of cruel people matter far less than the love of kind ones." Before Sarah could respond, her husband's voice cut across the yard. "Sarah, we're leaving now!" The young woman jumped up as if scalded, fear replacing the vulnerability in her eyes. "I have to go, but thank you." As she hurried away, Margaret noticed Theodore watching them with cold suspicion. Their eyes met across the yard, and Margaret saw something that might have been fear in his gaze. He'd beaten his barren wife and cast her aside, only to find her thriving while his fertile new bride wore the same bruises Margaret once had. "Margaret." Caleb's voice drew her attention. He looked exhausted, covered in soot and ash, but his eyes were warm. "Come see this." She transferred the sleeping Emma to Sarah's arms and followed him to where the neighbors had gathered. Hans Muller stepped forward, hat in hand. "We've been talking," he said gruffly. "What happened before, the punishment, it wasn't right. Some of us knew it then, but we stayed quiet. That was wrong of us." "Mrs. Henderson spoke up. Her usual sharp voice softened. "You saved those animals, risked your life. That's not the action of a cursed woman. That's—" She struggled for words. "That's what neighbors do." "We want to help rebuild," another man added. "All of us. It's the least we can do." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. These people who had watched her public humiliation, who had whispered behind their hands and avoided her gaze, were offering redemption not just for her, but for themselves. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. And so began the barn raising. Over the next weeks, the community came together in a way Margaret had never seen. Men who had stood in the mob that night came to swing hammers in daylight. Women who had called her cursed brought food and worked alongside her. It wasn't perfect. Some still whispered, still judged. Mayor Blackwood and his ilk stayed away, nursing their grudges. But something had shifted in Cedar Ridge's heart. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old, stronger and better built. Emma insisted on hanging her drawings inside to make it pretty for the animals. Thomas carved everyone's names into a beam, including Margaret's, right there with the rest of the Stone family. On the final day of construction, as Margaret served coffee to the workers, Reverend Morrison pulled her aside. "You've done something remarkable," he said quietly. "You've shown this town that grace can triumph over judgment, that love can overcome fear." "I didn't do anything," Margaret protested. "You survived," he interrupted. "And then you did more than survive. You chose to live, to love, to risk again. That takes a courage most of us will never possess." That evening, as the helpers departed and the Stone family stood admiring their new barn, Caleb took Margaret's hand. "We did it," he said simply. "We did," she agreed. But she was thinking of more than just the barn. They'd built something else these past weeks, a place for her in this community, a chance for healing on all sides. Emma tugged on her skirt. "Miss Margaret, can we put Hope's bed in the new barn? She wants to make sure the animals feel safe." Margaret looked down at the little girl, at the doll that had become a symbol of so much, and smiled. "Of course we can, sweetheart." As they walked toward the barn together, all 5 of them, a family forged by choice rather than blood, Margaret realized that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as tragedies. She'd lost her marriage, her reputation, her place in society. She'd endured 100 lashes and nearly lost the will to live. But from those ashes, like the barn itself, something new had risen, something stronger, truer, more beautiful than what had come before. The scars on her back would never fade, but perhaps, Margaret thought as she watched Emma carefully arrange Hope's bed in the barn while her siblings offered suggestions, perhaps scars were just another word for stories. Stories of survival, of courage, of finding light in the darkest places. And this story, she decided, was far from over. The town hall was packed to overflowing, citizens of Cedar Ridge crowding into every available space. Word had spread that Mayor Blackwood had called a special meeting to address the moral decay threatening our community. Everyone knew what, or rather, who he meant. Margaret sat between Caleb and Sarah in the front row, her spine straight despite the weight of all those eyes upon her. She'd wanted to stay away, but Caleb had insisted. "Running gives them power." He'd said, "We face this together." Emma fidgeted on Caleb's other side while Thomas sat rigid with barely contained anger. The boy had grown protective to the point of ferocity since the night of the mob. Mayor Blackwood took the podium, his face flushed with self-importance. "Citizens of Cedar Ridge, we gather today to address a cancer in our midst, a woman who defied God's natural order, who was justly punished for her barrenness, yet continues to spread her curse among us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others uncomfortable. Margaret noticed Sarah Morton Walsh sitting with her husband, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other covering a fresh bruise on her arm. "This woman," Blackwood continued, pointing directly at Margaret, "lives unwed in the home of a widower, corrupting his children, bringing shame upon our entire community. I move that she be formally banished from Cedar Ridge." Samuel Hancock stood up immediately. "I second the motion. We've tolerated this affront to decency long enough." But before the motion could gain momentum, Margaret rose to her feet. The hall fell silent, shocked that she would dare speak in her own defense. "Mayor Blackwood," she began, her voice clear and steady. "You speak of moral decay and shame. Very well. Let us speak of it. You have no right, Blackwood sputtered, but Margaret continued over him. I have every right. You had me whipped in the public square 100 lashes for the crime of being unable to bear children. You stood there, all of you. Her gaze swept the crowd and watched them flay the skin from my back because my womb remained empty. She heard gasps, saw some people lower their eyes in shame. Others leaned forward, transfixed. You called it justice. You called it God's will. Her voice grew stronger. But I ask you what God demands blood for barrenness, what justice punishes a woman for something beyond her control. The Bible says, someone called out. The Bible says many things. Margaret interrupted. It speaks of compassion, of mercy, of loving thy neighbor. Where was that love when you left me bleeding in the dirt? Where was that mercy when you tried to burn us out of our home? No one burned anything, Blackwood protested, but his denial rang hollow. Strange how the fire started the very night after your mob came calling, Thomas said loudly, jumping to his feet beside Margaret. Strange how it started in 3 places at once. More murmurs. Louder now. Many hadn't known about the mob, and those who did were beginning to see it in a different light. Margaret felt a presence at her back and turned to see other women rising, Mrs. Muller, Mrs. Chen, and surprisingly, several others she didn't know well. Mrs. Muller spoke first, her German accent thick with emotion. I lost 3 babies before my Hans was born. 3, by your logic. Mayor, I should have been whipped too. That's different, Hancock blustered. You eventually... No, Mrs. Chen interrupted, her usually quiet voice firm. Not different. I have 1 son. 1, after years of trying. My sister in San Francisco married 15 years. No children. Should she be beaten? Called cursed. One by one, women throughout the hall began to stand. Mrs. Johnson, who'd lost 2 children in infancy. Young Mrs. Carter, married 3 years without conceiving. Even elderly Mrs. Patterson, who'd raised 7 children but lost 4 others. Look around you, Mayor Blackwood, Margaret said, gesturing to the standing women. How many lashes do we all deserve? How many of us are cursed in your eyes? This is different, Blackwood insisted desperately. You're divorced, living in sin. I'm working as a housekeeper and governess, Margaret corrected. I sleep in my own room, teach the children their letters, and keep house for a family that lost its mother. Where exactly is the sin in that? Reverend Morrison stood now, his presence commanding attention. I've held my tongue too long, he said, his voice carrying to every corner. What happened to Mrs. Walsh was not justice, it was cruelty masquerading as righteousness, and I was complicit in my silence. The Reverend moved to stand beside Margaret. This woman has shown more Christian virtue in her suffering and survival than many who claim piety. She saved lives during the fire. She teaches children with patience and love. She has forgiven those who wronged her most grievously. Pretty words, Blackwood sneered. But the law? What law? A new voice demanded. Margaret turned to see Judge Harper, who'd been traveling circuit and missed recent events, entering the hall. Show me the statute that mandates whipping for barrenness. Show me the legal code that allows mobs to terrorize families in the night. Blackwood paled. It was community justice. It was mob rule. Judge Harper corrected sharply. And if anyone should face legal consequences, it's those who participated in an unlawful assault. The tide was turning. Margaret could feel it in the way people shifted, in the whispers that now carried condemnation of the mayor rather than her. Then Sarah Morton Walsh stood up. Theodore tried to pull her down, but she shook him off, her young face set with determination. You want to talk about shame, she said, her voice trembling but clear. My husband, the man who had his first wife beaten for barrenness, he beats me too. Not in public, not with whips, but with fists, behind closed doors where you all can pretend not to see. The hall erupted. Theodore jumped up, face red with rage, but Sarah continued.
I'm carrying his child, giving him what he said he wanted, and still it's not enough. Still I'm too slow, too stupid, too young. She looked directly at Margaret.
She warned me. That day after the fire, I didn't listen. I thought I was special, different. I was wrong.
Lies,
Theodore shouted. But the bruises on his wife's arms told their own truth. No, another woman called out Mrs. Garrett, whose husband was known for his temper. Not lies. We all know, we all whisper, but we say nothing because that's what proper ladies do, suffer in silence. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks as woman after woman began to speak not just about barrenness now, but about the myriad ways they suffered under the harsh judgment of men who demanded perfection while offering only criticism and violence in return.
Enough,
Blackwood shouted, pounding his gavel. This meeting is about Margaret Walsh's banishment.
No,
Caleb Stone said, standing slowly. He'd been silent until now, but his voice carried quiet authority. This meeting is about what kind of town Cedar Ridge wants to be. One that beats women for nature's workings, one that turns a blind eye to suffering, or one that offers mercy, second chances, and protection to those who need it. He looked around the room, meeting eyes with the men who'd come to his home that night. I've lived here 15 years, raised my children here, buried my wife here. I thought I knew this town's character. The night you came for Margaret, I learned I was wrong. Emma tugged on his coat. Tell them, Pa, tell them what Miss Margaret means to us. Caleb lifted his youngest daughter into his arms. This woman you want to banish, she saved my family. Not from fire, though she did that too. She saved us from grief that was drowning us. She taught Emma to read when I'd all but given up. She showed Sarah that strength comes in many forms. She gave Thomas something to protect, to believe in. His voice grew thick, and she reminded me that the heart can heal, even after loss. That's not a curse, that's a blessing. I call for a vote, Blackwood said desperately. All in favor of banishing Margaret Walsh. I call for a different vote, Judge Harper interrupted. All in favor of censoring Mayor Blackwood for abuse of power and inciting unlawful violence. Hands rose throughout the hall, not all, but more than half. Blackwood's face went from red to white as he realized he'd overplayed his hand. Furthermore, the judge continued, I move that any future cases of assault, whether public or private, be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. No more mob justice. No more turning away from bruises and broken spirits. This time, even more hands rose, especially among the women. Margaret stood in wonder as the meeting dissolved into chaos, Blackwood storming out, Theodore dragging his wife away, neighbors arguing and discussing. But through it all, she noticed something remarkable. People were looking at her differently, not with disgust or pity, but with respect. Mrs. Henderson approached hesitantly. I owe you an apology, she said stiffly. I was wrong about many things. One by one, others came forward. Some offered apologies, others simple nods of acknowledgement. Not everyone there would always be those who clung to their prejudices, but enough, more than enough. As the crowd finally dispersed, Margaret found herself outside with the Stone family, breathing in the cold evening air. You were magnificent, Sarah breathed, clutching Margaret's hand. The way you stood up there, the way you spoke truth. We all spoke truth tonight, Margaret replied, pulling the girl close. That's what changed things. Not just my voice, but all our voices together. Thomas kicked at the snow.
Does this mean they'll leave us alone now?
Some will, Caleb said honestly. Others, we'll see. But we showed them tonight that we won't be intimidated. That matters. Emma yawned hugely. Can we go home now? Hope needs her bedtime story. As they walked toward their wagon, Reverend Morrison caught up with them. Margaret, he said quietly, what you did tonight, it was like watching scripture come alive. the stone the builders rejected becoming the cornerstone. You've changed this town, perhaps saved it from its own darkness.
I didn't do it alone,
Margaret said, looking at the family around her. No, the Reverend agreed, smiling. The best changes never happen alone. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Margaret reflected on the evening's events. She'd stood before the town that had broken her body and tried to break her spirit. She'd spoken truth to power and found herself not alone, but surrounded by others who'd been waiting for someone to speak first. The vote hadn't been about banishment. In the end, it had been about identity, what kind of town Cedar Ridge would choose to be. And while the victory wasn't complete, while there would still be those who whispered and judged, something fundamental had shifted.
Miss Margaret,
Emma's sleepy voice broke into her thoughts.
Are you staying forever now?
Margaret looked at Caleb, saw the quiet hope in his eyes that matched what she felt in her heart. Yes, sweetheart, she said softly. I'm staying. She'd endured 100 lashes without crying. But tonight, surrounded by this family that had claimed her, riding home through a town that had finally begun to see her as human, Margaret let the tears fall freely. They were tears of joy. Winter deepened its hold on Kansas, transforming the prairie into a crystalline wilderness. The new barn stood strong against the howling winds, its timbers tight and true. Inside the stone house, warmth radiated not just from the fire, but from the family gathered around it. Margaret sat mending one of Thomas's shirts, her fingers steady on the needle. The simple domestic task brought her peace in a way she'd never expected. Across from her, Caleb worked on the farm ledgers while the children pursued their evening activities, Sarah reading, Thomas whittling, and Emma playing with Hope and the new wooden animals her brother had carved. Miss Margaret, Emma said suddenly, when will you marry Pa? The needle slipped, pricking Margaret's finger. She saw Caleb's pen pause mid-word, though he didn't look up.
Emma,
Sarah scolded, but there was curiosity in her eyes too. What? Emma protested.
Reverend Morrison said it would be proper, and Mrs. Muller told Mrs. Johnson that it's about time. I heard them talking after church.
Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the months since the town meeting, she and Caleb had grown closer, but neither had spoken of it directly. There were moments, his hand lingering when he helped her with her coat, the way his eyes found hers across the dinner table, the gentle care they took with each other's feelings, but nothing had been said aloud.
Emma, that's not appropriate dinner conversation,
Caleb said quietly, still focused on his ledgers. But his youngest daughter was not so easily deterred. Why not? We all love Miss Margaret. She loves us. You smile more when she's near. She hums when she's cooking your favorite foods. Even Hope knows you belong together. She has a point, Thomas added, looking up from his whittling. It's been almost a year now. People have stopped talking mean about Miss Margaret. Well, mostly stopped. And we need her.
We've always needed her,
Sarah said softly, setting down her book.
But Pa, she needs us too.
Needs to belong somewhere official-like, legal-like. Margaret's throat tightened at the girl's words. Sarah, wise beyond her 14 years, understood things the others might not, the precariousness of a woman's position without legal protection, the vulnerability of depending on kindness rather than right. Caleb finally set down his pen and looked at his children. What makes you think Miss Margaret would want to marry a widower with 3 children and a farm that barely breaks even? Because she loves us, Emma said simply, and we're wonderful. Despite the tension, Margaret found herself laughing.
You are indeed wonderful,
she agreed, reaching out to smooth Emma's hair. Then why won't you marry Pa? The little girl pressed. Margaret looked at Caleb, finding his eyes already on her. In them she saw the question he'd been too careful, too respectful to ask. The same question she'd been afraid to hear, afraid to answer, afraid to hope for. She began, then stopped. How could she explain the fear that still lived in her bones?
The memory of Theodore's promises turned to ash, of love transformed into contempt, of vows that had meant nothing when she'd failed to provide what was expected. But Caleb seemed to understand. He rose from his chair and crossed to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his. His children watched with breathless attention.
Margaret, he said quietly, I'm not him. I'm not Theodore Walsh, and I never will be.
I know, she whispered. Do you? His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. Because sometimes I see you pull back, see the fear flash in your eyes when things feel too good, too safe, as if you're waiting for it all to turn cruel.
Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears.
He saw her so clearly,
this man who'd taken her in broken and bloody, and never once made her feel less than whole.
The scars, she said quietly. They're not just on my back, Caleb. They're everywhere. In my heart, my mind. What if I can never give you children? What if—
Stop, he said firmly but gently.
I have 3 children who adore you, who need you. As for more—
He squeezed her hands.
Margaret, I would rather have you, just you, than a dozen sons. Not despite your scars, but because of them. Because they show me the strongest woman I've ever known. You barely knew me before, she pointed out, trying for lightness through her tears.
I knew enough, he replied. I knew you survived something that would have killed most people. I knew you didn't let it make you hard or bitter. I knew you looked at my children with love when the world had given you every reason to close your heart.
Thomas cleared his throat. Should we leave? This seems private-like.
No, Caleb said, not looking away from Margaret. You're right, this involves all of us. We're a family, and families make decisions together. He took a deep breath. Margaret Walsh, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you let me give you my name, my protection, and what's left of my heart? Would you be mother to my children and partner to me for whatever years God grants us? Margaret looked around at the faces watching her, Sarah, with hope shining in her eyes. Thomas trying to look nonchalant but gripping his whittling knife too tightly. Emma literally bouncing in her seat with excitement.
It's not just my decision, she said softly.
Children, would you truly want me as your mother? Not just Miss Margaret who helps and teaches, but your actual mother.
Yes,
Emma shouted, launching herself at Margaret.
Yes, yes, yes.
Thomas nodded firmly. You already are, in every way that matters.
Might as well make it legal.
Sarah rose and came to embrace Margaret from the other side. We chose you the night Pa brought you home. We've been choosing you every day since. Please choose us back. Margaret was crying fully now. Surrounded by love she'd thought she'd never feel again. She looked at Caleb through her tears.
Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. All of you.
The house erupted in celebration. Emma danced around the room with hope, singing a made-up song about weddings. Thomas actually smiled, wide and genuine. Sarah wept happy tears into Margaret's shoulder.
And Caleb?
Caleb kissed her forehead gently, a promise of patience and care and all the time she needed to trust in happiness again. When? Emma demanded, already planning.
Tomorrow tonight.
Give Miss Margaret time to prepare. Sarah laughed.
A woman needs a proper wedding dress. I don't need anything fancy,
Margaret protested, but Sarah shook her head. You stood in that town square in a torn dress. You faced them down at the meeting in borrowed clothes. You'll marry Pa in something beautiful that's yours, that shows everyone how treasured you are. The wedding took place 3 weeks later on a crisp winter morning. The church was full not because everyone approved, but because Margaret Walsh marrying Caleb Stone had become a symbol of something larger, of second chances, of redemption, of love conquering judgment. Margaret wore a dress of soft gray wool that Mrs. Muller and Mrs. Chen had helped her make, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't fancy by Eastern standards, but it was hers. made with love by women who'd become friends. Emma served as flower girl, scattering dried prairie roses saved from autumn. Sarah stood as Margaret's witness, while Thomas stood for his father. The boy had polished his boots to a mirror shine and looked years older in his borrowed suit. "Do you, Margaret Walsh, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Reverend Morrison asked, his voice warm with genuine joy.
"I do,"
Margaret said clearly, her eyes never leaving Caleb's. "Do you, Caleb Stone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Caleb replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And do you, Sarah, Thomas, and Emma Stone, take this woman to be your mother, to love and respect as she has loved and respected you?" "We do," the children chorused, Emma adding an enthusiastic, "Finally!" The congregation laughed, and even Margaret smiled through her tears. "Then, by the power vested in me by God and the state of Kansas, I pronounce you husband and wife, and you children officially the luckiest in Cedar Ridge. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, appropriate for public viewing, but Margaret felt the promise in it. This was not Theodore's possessive claiming, but something altogether different, a welcome home. As they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Stone, Margaret saw many faces, some still disapproving, some cautiously supportive. She saw Sarah Morton Walsh, her pregnancy advanced, sporting new bruises but also new determination she'd filed for separation. Scandal be damned. She saw the women who'd stood with her that night at the town meeting, nodding their approval. But mostly, she saw her family, her children, her husband, her home. At the wedding breakfast, held at the Stone farm with neighbors contributing dishes, Emma made an announcement.
"Hope needs a new name now,"
she declared, holding up the precious doll.
"She can't be Hope anymore because the Hope already happened. Miss Margaret married us."
"What will you call her then?" Margaret asked, smoothing her daughter's hair. Emma considered seriously. "Joy," she decided, "because that's what we have now." As the sun set on her wedding day, Margaret stood in the doorway of her home, truly her home, now watching Caleb help the children with evening chores. The scars on her back pulled when she moved, as they always would, but they no longer defined her. She thought of that morning nearly a year ago, when she'd stood tied to a post while a town watched her be whipped for the crime of barrenness. The woman she'd been then could never have imagined this moment married again. Mother to 3 beautiful children, respected by many who'd once scorned her. Thomas looked up from the chicken coop and waved. Sarah called something that made her father laugh. Emma ran toward the house, Joy the doll clutched in her arms, eager to tell her new mother something vitally important about the barn cat. Margaret Walsh Stone opened her arms to catch her youngest daughter, her wedding ring catching the last light of day. She had survived 100 lashes without crying. She had endured abandonment, condemnation, and attempts to break her spirit. But she had done more than survive. She had found the courage to love again, to trust again, to build a life from the ashes of the old. She had discovered that families could be chosen, that redemption was possible, and that sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as the worst catastrophes.
"Mama!"
Emma cried, the new title falling naturally from her lips.
"Mama, come see what the cat did."
"I'm coming, sweetheart," Margaret called back, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She was home.
Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story.
I hope Margaret's journey touched your heart as it did mine. Please comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I love connecting with readers from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic frontier tales of love, courage, and redemption. Share your thoughts about Margaret and Caleb's story in the comments. What part moved you the most?